Good morning. I got to play with the scroll thing again this week. Yeah. Let go and let God. Anybody in here ever heard that phrase? Maybe it's your life's phrase. Wouldn't that be just a truly great way to actually live? Now, I don't know about you, but I've used that phrase before, and unfortunately, I've used that phrase to avoid stuff too. Anybody ever done that? It might even be something God has squarely placed in my lap, but if I'm being real honest here, there's been times when I push it off my lap, all in the name of, let go and let God. I'm the only one, right? Welcome today. We're going to talk about the wall that Nehemiah was working on there, and really, if you've not been with us, I would encourage you to go back on our website and view the other messages in this series. But really, this period of history that we're dealing with is actually the pinnacle period of history of the Old Testament. So even though as far as the order of the books, it looks like, wait a minute, there's a whole bunch of Old Testament left after the book of Nehemiah, it's actually, this is it. This is the last really bit of historical stuff we get before what people call this 400 years of silence. Now, I don't know about you, but even in times where I've been walking really hard away from God, He's never really been silent, has He? There were things happening in the world, but I just want to welcome you here and encourage you in that. If you're tuning in with us online, we want to welcome you. We thank you for engaging with us through the week as well with our Facebook page and things, so thanks for being with us. Okay, I got another phrase for you. It might be just as familiar to a certain segment of age group here. It's not quite as religious of a phrase, but it's also pretty good advice in some things. See if you recognize this. Hold on loosely, but don't let go. If you cling too tightly, you're going to lose control. A few of you. All right. Bonus points. Anybody know the group's name that sang that? Who? Nope. 38 Special. How about the year? 1981. 1981. They actually recorded that period of time. I think it was 78 to 81 in there, 79, something like that. I was just really starting to cut my teeth on rock music at that point, and that was one of my favorite songs. All right, so these two ideas, though, let go and let God, hold on loosely, but don't let go. If you cling too tightly, you're going to lose control. We're going to marry those up today. The thing is, they've really been in every church leader's head since the pandemic began. For sure, since the pandemic began. But even before that, culture has been changing very rapidly. So the big question is, how do we adapt to the surrounding conditions and stay on mission of making disciples of Jesus Christ? How do we do that? And Nehemiah can really teach us some things in that regard. So what I'm going to say today is that we do two things in this era of change. And make no mistake, we, the culture and the church, we're in an era of rapid change. So two things. We let go and let God, and we hold on loosely but don't let go, even as we heed this cautionary little addendum part that if we cling too tightly, we're going to lose control. And so we look into God's Word to help us see how to live on purpose for God in this time of shift and in an era of change, because that's something that's been consistent throughout history, these periods of change. And that is the context when we look into this wall rebuild that's happening in Jerusalem in 444 BC. Now, last week, we looked at these two guys, Sanballat and Tobiah, and in this surrounding area, they were watching and they're taunting the Jews, and there's this whole history of this opposition to what God's doing among God's people. Now, it's interesting that the reason the walls lay in ruin is because sometimes the opposition to God's work amongst God's people is strongest by God's people. You ever thought of that? Like sometimes, the phrase, we're our own worst enemy, okay? That happens a lot. That's how the walls in Jerusalem were in the shape they were in, because the Jews hadn't taken care of the relationship with God. So these walls and the temple and all the outer stuff that was broken down, that just mirrored this internal reality that they had just gotten really dead inside. They were distracted from living in relationship with God, and they were so distracted they got to a point of destruction in that. Now, I don't know about you, believer or unbeliever, aren't there times where you just feel empty inside? Like you could look in a mirror, and if you could see a picture of a wall, it'd be broke down. It'd be a mess. Well, I want to give you some hope today. all right? Because it don't have to stay that way. So the people, they long to come home. They've been in exile. They were taken away from their land by these foreign enemies. And God just uses the kingdoms of the world and all those things, and He brings them back to Jerusalem out of exile. And they get back to it, and they're building, and they're shoulder to shoulder, we talked about. They worked, all kinds of folks on the wall project. But not just anybody was there on the wall project. The enemy wasn't given a place on the wall. I hope if you're building a legacy, if you're building anything in your life, that you don't allow the enemy of your soul a place on your wall, okay? Because that's going to make a real mess of things. So the enemy, in this case, Tobiah and Sanballat, they're content to make fun of the builders. After all, the thing is, these Jews, they're not professional wall builders. There was no building permit or a lot of things taken care of. I mean, they just started building this wall together. And they're even led by the king's royal sommelier. This guy's a wine taster. He's a wine connoisseur, and he's the leader of this big project. So the enemies, they make jokes. And the enemies, they're loud. And they're angry. And their jokes aren't even all that good. I better not tell that story. Okay, so they talk about the weakness of the Jews, and they talk about the worship practices of the Jews, and they talk about the broken materials that are laying all over the place. They're basically calling the old wall trash. They talk about how weak the new structure will be. And so Nehemiah, as a leader, he begins to react to what is happening around him. And he does both these things that we talked about. He lets go and he lets God, but he also holds on loosely without letting go. Nehemiah 4, starting in verse 4, if you're in the Pew Bible there, I think it's around page 750-ish, if you want to follow along. Verse 4, "Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn their reproach on their own heads and give them as plunder to a land of captivity. Do not cover their iniquity and don't let their sin be blotted out from before you, for they have provoked you to anger before the builders." Okay, so interesting thing about prayers in the Old Testament, oftentimes they are pretty like, you know what, this guy's a jerk, God, and I really wish you'd just kind of strike him down or make him shut up or whatever. And we kind of don't think about prayer that way today. You know, we've got the Acts model, adoration, confession, thanksgiving, and supplication, and we learn about what all those words mean. And there's this thing called imprecatory prayer that's really kind of this thing where, like, God, I really wish you'd take care of that guy because he is a thorn in my side. That's what kind of prayer this is here. So Nehemiah is doing what here? He knows he's got a project before him, so he lets go and he lets God. He's like, God, here's what we got. Here it is. He gives it to God. He offers God a few suggestions that are in line with his time and culture. Today, we might ask for relief from somebody who is oppressing us. We would ask for truth to prevail. And we understand that our enemy, the devil, our main enemy, uses people to oppose God's work in the world. But we also know that through Christ, the people that the enemy uses can be won over. So we pray for that too. So in that, we let go and let God. Now, at first, Nehemiah's reaction is solely a spiritual one. He prays for God's intervention against his enemies, and the Jews forge ahead. So we get to verse 6. "So we built the wall, and the entire wall was joined together up to half its height, for the people had a mind to work." The word for mind here is related more to the will, the heart, in a seat of passion kind of way. The mind heart had partnered with the hands to see what the mind's eye only could see. They longed so much to see this restoration of worship to God in Jerusalem that they could see it. You ever want something so badly, and it's not right in front of you, but man, you just got to close your eyes for a second and you see it? That's how they felt about the restoration of this wall. And so it motivated them to keep moving together on this project. And God had prescribed this worship centuries before. So they keep working. The wall is up to half its height. What's the enemy going to do? He's got to ante up, right? So verse 7, "Now it happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the walls of Jerusalem were being restored and the gaps were beginning to be closed, that they became very angry. And all of them conspired together to come and attack Jerusalem and create confusion. I don't know about you, but I've had times in my life where that's exactly what it felt like. The enemy came at me for no other reason than to stop whatever it was I was doing and to create confusion. And if I'm being real honest, he's been successful from time to time. Anybody identify with that? Yeah, absolutely. When the gaps are closing, the footholds that the enemy needs to be able to invade, when those are starting to close, he wants to tear things up. And when the enemy sees that, it angers him. As the Jews were closing in on this restored worship of God, when the picture is getting complete, the enemy is going to do whatever he can that's going to create chaos. So verse 9, nevertheless, we made our prayer to God, and because of them, we set a watch against them day and night. Okay, so they didn't just stop. They kept rolling forward. They adjusted to the situation. The situation had changed around them, but the mission had not. They let go and let God, and then they still held on to the work they were doing. They had more prayer, but they set this watch. They get an ear to the track of what's happening around them and an eye to the horizon to see what might be coming. But then things change. They become keenly aware of the change that is happening. I mean, the wall is one thing. It's the good thing that was intended. We're up to half the height. Man, this is like supernatural speed here. But this opposition that's happening, this is not a good thing. And it's really discouraging at first. Verse 10, then Judah said, the strength of the laborers is failing, and there is so much rubbish that we're not able to build the wall. Okay, so they're halfway up with this thing. Now, halfway is a big deal here. This is not something that's taking eons to get done. This is something that they're doing in a matter of days, and they're doing it together. This is truly a miraculous kind of inspired community effort, and it is succeeding, but there's this shift, this intensified opposition. So now they're having to watch their backs. And they're also having to move the old stuff as well as building the new stuff, and it's starting to take its toll on them. And they don't know how to handle it efficiently at this point. They're tripping over themselves. You ever felt like that? You're tripping all over yourself. And that happens, doesn't it? I mean, we know that we want to make a change in our life, either individually or collectively, and we're trying to figure out what to keep and knowing what to throw away and how to repurpose this thing or that thing. And all of it takes energy. I mean, my great-great-great-grandpa might have laid that rock there, or he might have used this method for moving dirt, or how can I use what's left and put it with what's new to make this thing work? Verse 11, and our adversary said, they will neither know nor see anything till we come into their midst and kill them and cause the work to cease. So it was when the Jews who dwelt near them came that they told us 10 times, from whatever place you turn, they're going to be upon us. Well, that's not helpful. They're watching their backs, and then there's this open, hostile propaganda campaign, and it's not without merit. Sanballat can back it up. He's got an army. All these other guys, Sanballat, Tobiah, they're openly doing whatever they can to break this thing down. And they're not even being sneaky about it. They're trying to break the will of the people. And these Jews that are acting as couriers of the message, they're repeating this over and over that the enemy had them surrounded. Have you ever felt surrounded? You ever felt surrounded? Like you're working out the stuff God has planned for you, and you meet some opposition to it, and then beyond opposition, it feels like you're doomed to fail. You're halfway in, but things are starting to pile up, and there's all this potential, but there's also this heaviness. And so again, Nehemiah does both things. He lets go and lets God. The things that he can't control, he's absolutely letting go of and letting God take care of it. But he also holds on loosely to the things that he can control, realizing that he's in the middle of a really rapidly changing situation. Verse 13, therefore I positioned men behind the lower parts of the wall at the openings, and I set the people according to their families, with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and arose and said to the nobles, to the leaders, and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, great and awesome, and fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. Nehemiah never loses sight of what the vision is, what the goal is. Now we can contrast that with how it was when the Hebrews came out of Egypt 1,000 years before or so. They encountered opposition. And they were like, I just wish we could go back in time. I just wish we could go back to the good old days when we were just plain old slaves, but we had plenty to eat. Sometimes we do that, don't we? Following God is both hard and easy at the same time. And when we hit those hard parts, sometimes we're just like, you know what? It was easier when I was just a fat, dumb, and happy sinner. I mean, it was. And, in some regards, on this side of heaven, yeah. I mean, I feel you that I've been there. Nehemiah doesn't look backwards. Actually, he does. Let me take that back. He looks back one spot that he looks to the past to inform their future. There is one thing that Nehemiah sees from the past that absolutely is going to inform how they move forward. And that one thing is he looks at God's track record. And the people, he reminds the people that God is great and awesome. He looks rearward only enough to reinform their future. And in the midst of all that opposition, all that rubble, all that discouragement, he retools, he changes things around, he holds on loosely, but he doesn't lose control. He's getting things in the position that he needs them to as God moves us forward. He makes the shifts that need to happen. Church, there are things to deal with in this life. There's stuff to deal with, and some of it, I'm gonna really surprise you here. Some of it I'm not good at. Nobody's giggling. It wasn't a surprise. I mean, let's talk about it here in our own context for just a minute. Sprinklers. I am so thankful. I'm really, truly thankful in the Lord for guys like Bob McLean and Kim Jorgensen, because I come from a land of no sprinklers. I mean, a very few people watered their grass, and most of the rest of us thought they were absolutely crazy. Now, I understand timers, but all the little valves and sprinkler heads and electricity and wires the size of telephone wires, all of them coming together out in the yard to make things pop up out of the ground and spread water in a certain pattern, none of that makes sense to me. I mean, in Indiana, we waited. You didn't have to wait long. There would be water that came from the sky. I know you guys are like, really? That happens? And there's other things. I mean, even here within our church, like we've had retirements and staff changes since I've been here, both here and at Wonderland. And I know that those things are kind of inevitable in any organization as time moves forward. And none of them have been totally unexpected, but it's still a thing. And then just leading anything from a bake sale to a board meeting to a church in a post-COVID, I hope I can actually say post-COVID, and at least not pandemic. I guess we're endemic now. But all of that, we're seeing this accelerated post-Christian culture in our country. And if you haven't figured that out yet, that's where we are. It's a thing. One of my newer pastor buddies here in the area, he was talking at one of our last meetups, and he said that he knows that they must have had Democrats and Republicans in their congregation, but until the last few years, nobody really knew who was who in that regard. Culture has shifted dramatically in the last 2 years. People are at each other. And then for us, personally, there was this whole move in here thing. We'd never even been to a place called California. And then we're having to be a buyer in the midst of a housing boom for sellers. We could have just waited a year, right? And those are just a few of my favorite things, as Julie Andrews said, from The Sound of Music. And I want us to be shoulder to shoulder. I want to be on that wall when it was good, and we're shoulder to shoulder, and we're building the community of American River Community Church, and we're leading folks to Christ, and we're leading them deeper with Christ. We're helping them find freedom, and then we're exporting them to service for Christ. And I want to do all that stuff, and yet we have stuff. Like, we have the mission of making disciples, and we have the vision. And I don't know if you're a part of this church and have been a part of this church for a while. Even if you haven't, if you take the Great Commission seriously, like God's desire for us is not to just occupy a spot about this big on a pew on a Sunday morning, but there's more to it than that. That we're to make disciples, and we have the vision of our community being changed in all sorts of ways by you and me reflecting the love of Jesus to others. We have that, but sometimes it would be real tempting to lay down our hammers and take off our gloves and pine away for the good old days, if I'm just being real honest. And the thing is, there's only one thing that has ever been consistently good about the good old days, and it's not the days. So sometimes, just like Nehemiah did here with these guys, he made the adjustments to keep things moving forward. And as he's doing that, he tells them to remember not the good old days. What's he tell them to remember? He tells them to remember how great and awesome the eternal God is that we serve. Imagine, just put yourself right there with him just for a minute. And you're there on the wall, and you're not a professional wall builder, but you can move a rock from point A to point B, and that's what God's calling you to. And there's this opposition, and work is going on, and you're really doing it. And it's really happening. The opposition continues to build. The more progress you make, the louder those voices get, and the worse the jokes are, and the jeers and the taunts and all of that stuff. And then all of a sudden things change, and the swords are handed out, and it's every family there on the wall, and it's not some professional army anymore. It's not the paid spokesmen anymore. It's all of us in this together. And you don't want to fight. But there's something deep inside of you that knows that for right now, for this moment, you were made for this. There's a holy kind of calm and a supernatural stirring all at once. And you're on the wall there, and it starts out faint, but the sound keeps growing. And you know without a doubt that no matter what comes, this is who you are, and God is showing you who He is. Maybe it sounds like this. Our God is an awesome God. He reigns from heaven above with wisdom, power, and love. Our God is an awesome God. Our God is an awesome God. He reigns from heaven above with wisdom, power, and love. Our God is an awesome God.
An awesome God, He reigns from heaven above with wisdom, power, and love. Our God is an awesome God. Our God is an awesome God. He reigns from heaven above with wisdom, power, and love. Our God is an awesome God. God, He reigns from heaven above with wisdom, power, and love. Our God is an awesome God.
Can I just say that very often, in a lot of ways, we have these Nehemiah moments, folks, where that's the reminder that our God is an awesome God. In a lot of ways, leadership is hard, but sometimes it can be pretty easy. And you say, well, how does that work? Because in spite of all the stuff, all the things, all the whatever it might be, we renew our vision best by first looking upon the one who gives us that vision of a world redeemed by His love and mercy and grace and justice and holiness. And I don't know about you, but in those moments, I want nothing of sin and more of Him. It's when I get off track, when I get off mission of what God put me on this planet for, that I chase all kinds of stupid. But when I remember why I'm here, I want nothing of sin and more of Him. Karen, we're going to go ahead and skip to the verses there. And it happened when our enemies, verse 15, heard that it was known to us and that God had brought their plot to nothing, that all of us returned to the wall, everyone to his work. So it was from that time on that half of my servants worked at construction, the other half held the spears, the shields, the bows, and wore armor. And the leaders were behind all the house of Judah. Those who built on the wall and those who carried burdens loaded themselves so that with one hand they worked at construction and with the other hand held a weapon. They're not construction workers and they're not soldiers. And yet look at what's happening here. Every one of the builders had his sword girded at his side as he built, and the one who sounded the trumpet was beside me. Then I said to the nobles and the rulers and the rest of the people, the work is great and extensive, and we're separated far from one another on the wall. Whenever you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. So we labored in the work, and half of the men held the spears from daybreak until the stars appeared. At the same time, I also said to the people, let each man and his servant stay at night in Jerusalem, that they may be our guard by night and a working party by day. So neither I, my brethren, my servants, nor the men of the guard who followed me took off our clothes, except that everyone took them off for washing. See, that's how you know that the Bible is true, because that's a detail. Basically, they're saying, we just kind of walked around stinky, but it was worth it. What if, when things had heated up and they were surrounded, they had held only to the way they were first building the wall? When the opposition was present, but it was mainly just jokes and jeers. What if they had just I'm just going to ignore that. We're just going to keep stacking rocks. What if they had just said, hey, you know what? This is the way we've always done this wall building thing. It's the way we've always done it. Or what if when it really heated up and they were surrounded and Nehemiah said, hey, pick up your swords and we got to do it this way and that way and we're going to have to do some things differently. What if they said, we've never done it that way? What if they had said, well, let's just go back to Babylon? At least back in the good old days, we weren't surrounded like this and a sword wasn't part of my everyday workwear. I mean, that would have been a mess, right? They would have been attacked and defeated. That happens in our lives too, It happens in our churches. It happens in anything that we're a part of. When we lose sight of the mission, when it gets hard, and there's a vision out there that hey, we want to see our communities changed as followers of Jesus, reflect His love, as we see that our mission is to invite all to Jesus and follow Him together, to make disciples. And in my own life, when I make some progress and I get the wall built about halfway, and there's restoration of worship about halfway, and there's this thing in my life that just keeps getting me down, and I back away from it. I keep trying the same old things to try to fight the devil off at this point or that point. And then I look at Nehemiah and what actually happened instead of just going back to the same old, same old. Well, they kept the main thing, restoring this wall, which was part of restoring worship and their relationship with God. They kept the main thing the main thing. They didn't lose sight of their vision, and they stayed on mission. They let go and let God when it came to the enemy. That didn't mean that they stopped moving forward. It means they were willing to adapt their methods to the mission at hand. It meant they were willing to change how they did it for the vision of doing it. And then they built them some serious wall. And they held on loosely. They didn't hold on to their old methods so tightly that it constrained them. They understood that the method was always about putting the mission forward. So they adapted, not just so they could survive, but so they could thrive in this project. I mean, that last big bit of scripture that I read, they totally revamped the outward appearance and practice of how they operated. And they still kept the main thing the main thing. And so then this synergy reappears and is shoulder to shoulder and all hands on deck once again. And they have this rallying trumpet blast if they need it to get everybody where they need to go. And it's interesting that if they have to blow the trumpet and everybody gathers there, who's going to fight? God is going to fight for us. So it's almost like you're going to get the blessing of seeing what God is doing. Yeah, show up with your sword and all those kind of things, and God might move this a certain way, but really it's God who's going to fight for us. They had that brief moment where they were overwhelmed and the old rubble and the current enemies and the enormity of the work got them down. But by holding on loosely to the way they were doing things, by not clinging too tightly, they didn't lose control. And all it really took for things to change was for Nehemiah to remind them of the great and awesome God they serve. I've been privileged to be a part of some pastors' groups this last couple of weeks, and some of them been online, some of them in person, and discussions about the changing landscape in our country. And in other pastors' groups I've been a part of, this is stuff we've been talking about for a few years now. And I got to say, as a pastor and being in those groups, that the window for analysis is closing as the time for movement is upon us. We used to have a saying in my old church, every member a minister. But we never fully realized that. And I think it's because we had gotten comfortable and the squeeze wasn't enough to produce the juice. But I think we're in the squeeze now. This world that we live in, it has always needed Jesus. And we have Jesus. And that's what we have to offer the world. And nearly to a person, as I get in these discussions, we're all seeing the same things. That the people of our culture, they don't learn or communicate or prioritize or act like they did even 10 years ago. It's all different. And so I look at this story out of Nehemiah and I realize that just like Nehemiah reacts to his surroundings as they built, that we keep building, but we adapt and we shift for maximum effectiveness in our mission to make disciples of Christ. Where it might have been that 10, 15, 20 years ago, you'd put out something and you'd get 20 people to show up. And that was like, wow, hey, we gauged this. We got 20 people that showed up to this thing. Now, what if we have 5 people who gather 4? That's still 20 people. What if we have 5 people who gathered 5? We just gained. Things are changing, folks. And this world still needs the same Jesus that we have always had. And so we station things around the walls a little differently, and we do things in such a way that makes our faith truly the relational faith that God has built for us. The why of it all, saved souls who seek to save souls. And the how, the how that it gets done is by God's greatness and power. Those are so much more important than the mechanics. And so we move forward on mission with renewed vision, shifting and changing where we can to invite people home. The story in the New Testament about the prodigal that he wanders away from his family. He doesn't wander. He's full on like, you know what? I don't want to stay here with you, Dad and brother. I want to go do my own thing. And not only is my own thing not something you would approve of, but it's like insanely destructive, and I'm going to burn through all of it. And he comes back. If you don't know Jesus now, you're that prodigal, and he's calling you home. You got all these other things that we worry about, you know, as far as, well, does the church believe that, or do they think this or that, or what about this thing over here, or I'm doing this thing in my life and I'd have to totally retool to come in conformity of this thing. And you know what? God's got all that worked out. But if you don't know who Jesus is, then that's the main thing. This isn't about conforming to a certain a set of rules. This is whether you are alive or dead. Because Jesus didn't come to make bad people good. He came to make dead people live. And to live forever. That's what we want to invite people into at this church. And so today we're going to sing again about God. And as we sing about God, I want to encourage you to think about where you stand with that. And if you need to make some kind of a decision today in this moment, this isn't the old-fashioned altar call. I mean, there have been times in my life as a preacher, and I've not been a preacher that long, but where it would have been really gratifying to see a whole bunch of people sobbing and up at the front and all that kind of thing. Hey, if that's where you're at this morning, then by all means. But if you need to make a decision, I just encourage you not to wait. Okay, because here's what happens when we wait. We start listening to all those other voices around the wall, and we think, well, this is too hard, or how do I move this old stuff to get it out of the way so I can build this new thing? And God's got all that well in hand. Okay, the thing that you can offer him is your yes, and that's really all you got to bring to the table. So that's what I encourage you this morning. I want to pray, and we'll sing. Go ahead and stand up, and we'll pray together here. God, you are an awesome God. In the Old Testament, all of this stuff points to the time when Jesus is going to come, and he's going to restore all things. And it didn't happen the way they thought it would there in the first century. And in fact, he ends up on a cross. And the disciples were probably thinking, how in the world could this happen? And yet Jesus had told them, this is what's going to happen, because you can't handle your sin. Only I can. And sin had to be killed so that people could live. And as Jesus, as you hung there on the cross, you said, I think what might have been the hardest thing I've ever, two things you said. One was, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. And you also said, my God, why have you forsaken me? We stand as recipients of that forgiveness. And we stand in such a way that we don't ever have to utter that unless we stand before you, God, having rejected your offer of salvation. And so this morning, I pray collectively for our church that as we navigate this time of unprecedented change in our culture, that we do it in such a way that continues to point to you, that we keep you as the main object, the only object of our worship. And that we truly extend the love that you've given us to other people, and we tell them of the forgiveness that you offer. We thank you for the way in which you have loved us. In Jesus' name, amen.